Well, that's really the question of the day, isn't it? We started talking about whether the current interest in climate change, global warming, indicates that we're really getting politically engaged in this situation. And I suggested, well, perhaps, but again, perhaps not. Real engagement with this would bring recognition that the growth ethic is done for. You see, what we've been discussing here is the increasing scale of the human enterprise relative to the ecosphere. Human beings are becoming more numerous, still at the rate of about 70 million a year. But far more important that our per capita consumption of resources and energy continues to increase as well. So in effect, people are becoming not only more numerous, but bigger in terms of their individual impact on the planet. Now, if you believe, and it were true, that the human system is effectively separated from the rest of nature, that isn't necessarily a problem. But if the reality is, and this is the thing I believe in, is that human beings are simply one species of many millions that exist within the ecosphere, within ecosystems, then we're in a very different situation. Because there's only a fixed amount of new energy, photosynthetic energy, that's created every year to power the entire ecosystem. The more humans take, the less there is for everything else. Every act of human so-called economic production is really an act of consumption under the second law of thermodynamics. No economic process can take place without dissipating energy and material. Even though we produce something like a glass or a computer, the amount of energy and material dissipated that becomes a contaminant in nature in order to produce that thing is vastly larger than the energy matter contained within the product itself. So the concept of limits to growth begins to re-emerge. When the human enterprise was small relative to the scale of the ecosphere, this didn't matter because there was sufficient capacity within the ecosphere to process and assimilate the wastes and indeed to produce the materials that we were using in our production processes. But as the scale of the human enterprise has increased, we're now exceeding the rate at which nature is producing resources. So we consume resources faster than nature produces, and as a result, we're dissipating waste much more quickly than nature can process and assimilate those wastes. This is the fundamental imbalance between the human enterprise and nature. We're literally consuming the ecosphere from the inside out. Fish stocks are collapsing. Our soil resources are eroding anywhere from 10 to 30 times faster on average than they can be produced. Forests are in decline, particularly the tropical forests, which have so much of an important role to play in global climate. We're just using these things up more quickly than they can be produced in nature. And the other side, of course, is the throughput of all energy and material. All of it emerges, 100% of it, ultimately, as dissipated and degraded waste. So climate change is not just climate change, it's the result of the accumulation of dissipated fossil fuel in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Toxic contamination of our food supply is the result of industrial dissipants or toxic contamination into the air, water, and soil, and so on. So again, we've reached the point where just the sheer level of human activity is overwhelming the self-productive capacities of the ecosphere and the assimilative capacities. And since the ecosphere is a complex system, it will respond in unanticipated ways. And whereas we could have ignored this 100 years ago, we can no longer afford to. See, what people don't understand, it seems to me, is that the very act of growth of the human enterprise changes the context within which we've been allowed to grow. So we reach the point at which something that was totally appropriate and perhaps necessary and useful 100 years ago becomes maladaptive, inappropriate, and totally destructive when you've reached the limits. And I think we're very, very close to those limits today. In fact, you know, our own work on ecological footprint analysis suggests we're about 25% over the long-term sustainable limits. We've developed a technique whereby we can measure crudely, but plus or minus, say, 20%, the amount of productive ecosystem required to support any prescribed lifestyle. So if you were to tell me what your annual shopping basket looks like, and you did this from one year to the next, we could show you just how much productive cropland, forest land, grazing land, assimilative lands are required to produce the resources that you consume and to assimilate the wastes that are produced in that consumption process. And this area would be your personal ecological footprint. It's a measure or an estimate of the area of the Earth's surface dedicated to supporting just you in the style to which you're accustomed. Now, when we do this for various nations, several things become clear. The first is that many nations with high incomes and relatively high populations vastly exceed their own productive capacity. So that a country like the Netherlands or Japan uses 6-7 times as much ecosystem outside of its boundaries to support its current level of consumption, its lifestyle, as is contained within the nation. So most of the wealthy world is in a state of what we call ecological deficit. It's consuming far more ecological or biophysical output of the planet than is produced within its own domestic territory. In other words, it's consuming at higher levels than its income. It's as if you're running a deficit on your credit card. In fact, when you go to the world as a whole, that's exactly what we see. That the world as a whole is now using up resources as if the world were about 1.25 planets. So we're using fisheries, we're degrading soils, we're doing all of these things as if the planet were about 25% more productive than it is. So the first question that arises is, well, how can we be living on a planet that seems to be 25% bigger than the one we've got? And the answer is because nature over a period of 4 billion years built up enormous stocks of resources. The fossil fuel that powers our industrial society today took hundreds of millions of years to accumulate. And we're eroding them at 10,000 times faster than those fuel supplies built up. Soils. In Canada, we had the richest Chernozem soils on Earth at the turn of the 19th century. Well, in some 120 years or so, what am I talking about, 107 years of mechanized agriculture, we've reduced those soils to less than half of what was there before in terms of organic matter and nutrient content and so on and so forth. They've been dissipated by heavy industrial use. So it's possible to be in a state of overshooting the long-term capacity of the system if you are drawing down or liquidating capital stock. And that's precisely what we're doing. We're living on the capital instead of on the annual interest or income from our natural capital. Now you can do that for a limited period of time. But at some point, you reach a situation where the remaining natural capital, the forests, the waters, the soils, and so on and so forth, are inadequate to sustain the levels of consumption demanded by the human enterprise. And at that point, you get into very severe resource constraints, and I think we'll begin to see a breakdown in civil order. In fact, you could argue, and many are arguing this, that that's what we're seeing today. The Iraq War may be over oil. But it's only the first shot in the resource wars of the future, if you believe someone like Michael Clare, who writes extensively about this problem. There's a big confrontation, I think, emerging in Africa between China and the United States over African oil deposits. There may be a similar conflict between the U.S., China, and Russia over Russia's oil and gas deposits. So the more we demand of nature, and the more we create an expectation that this expansive train can continue to carry on down the track, the more likely we are to reach a point where nature simply can't provide what we're demanding. And because we've built such enormous expectations, we will get into significant conflicts among nations in a desperate struggle to maintain the status quo against all the evidence.